First off, Brian, I would love to thank you for coming to Public Health Landscape to talk about your art and how you got there. So first, if you could just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah, my name is Bryan David Griffith. Um, I make my living as a visual artist here. Lots of things I do in life, but that's what I'm doing for a living here for the last 20 years. A lot of my work is about um, conservation, environmental issues, and things like that. And I work in a lot of different media, including photography, painting, sculpture, installation. And throughout my career, I've changed my medium and techniques based on whatever concept I'm addressing at the time. So I think the work that you're interested in here is about wildfire. And so for that project, I've used a lot of natural materials, fire itself as a medium to create large scale installations about wildfire and our relationship to it.
Okay. Yes, we're definitely interested in focusing a little bit on that rethinking fire, but you also have done some work with watershed, et cetera. So you say you focus more on the ecological and environmental aspects. How do you pick what's going to be your next project or what goes into that process? And are you trying to relay a message through your art as well?
Yeah, I think most recently the projects have kind of chosen me in a way, um, meaning that the issues have come up or the opportunities that are affecting me or my community locally. Um, so with watershed, for instance, here in Flagstaff, we have wildfires, we have floods that result from wildfires. Um, we of course have water availability and use issues here in the we're up at 7,000 feet, but we're in the desert Southwest, so there are no perennial streams or water sources that flow from here, and so the use of the aquifer is a big issue. Um, Development and use of our public lands is an issue, and so I've been directly affected by these, or my community has. And so, I feel compelled to address those issues in my work as a result of that. I don't know where the next project is coming from or where it was going to be. I didn't know I was going to be working on wildfire, for instance, until a series of two things happened. Back in 2014, I got a call from a curator to work on a project here that was based in our local art center, the Coconino Center for the Arts, on a project about wildfire. Flagstaff is also the home of Northern Arizona University and the home of a test forest that is over 100 years old. So it's a center for forestry research. And in 2014, there was a project funded by the Joint Fire Science Consortium, which is a consortium of federal agencies, and National Endowment for the Arts for a project for 10 artists to study wildfire with scientists in the field over a year period and create a group project about that. Um, that project was called Fires of Change. And so in 2014, I got a call from the curator asking if I wanted to be one of those 10 artists to join the project as a photographer. And I was mainly doing photography at the time. I hadn't done work with wildfire previously. I've done a lot of work, for Arizona Highways magazine, for um, kind of environmental landscape work before, but not specifically on the issue of wildfire. But he had seen my work and liked what I was doing and invited me to join a project. Now that's really unusual if you're not an artist that, someone is coming to you and offering you a grant to work on a project. It's almost always the other way around. Like we're always chasing the opportunities. We're applying for grants. Um, and so I was surprised to get this call. And but I said, well, let me think about it. Even though it was a great opportunity. And the reason I said, let me think about it was because I was going to have to spend so much time in the field that I knew I was going to, lose money on the project. Even though you're getting a grant, it's a small portion of the time that you're going to spend. And I was going to have to cancel other shows, festivals, and opportunities and give up a lot of income to put in the time necessary. Um, so I was excited and intrigued by the project, but I wasn't sure I could make it work financially, even with that grant support. So I asked for, he gave me a week to kind of think about it and get back to them. And it was literally a few days later when the slide fire broke out, which was a big fire in 2014 north of Sedona. And it went up Oak Creek Canyon, which was my home was between Flagstaff and Sedona. And so, um, and so then I got a second call, which was an automated um, pre-evacuation notice from the Coconino County Sheriff saying your home was potentially in the path of this fire, so you need to prepare to evacuate. Now I got this call when I was on the East Coast at a show in Washington D.C. So I'm on the other side of the country, and all of my work at the time was analog on film. So all my livelihood and life's work was back at my home in Flagstaff. And so we're frantically making calls, telling friends and family, "Can you go and get some of the film archives and things from my house?" And deciding, what we were willing to let go and what we were trying to salvage. And it was national news at the time, so I was seeing, the dramatic walls of flames and firefighters, all that footage um, was on the news in the DC area. So I kind of saw, what was, yeah, what was happening, and and ash is falling in our yard, and friends and family are sending us pictures. So I'm seeing what's happening, and going through that as anybody who has ever evacuated has had to go through. But I also saw how it's portrayed in the media, which informed my work later on. Um, and there's stages you go through in that process, and we ended up being okay. The wind shifted. The hot shots and wildfires did an incredible job in difficult terrain. And the slide fire, for the most part, no remarkably, no lives were lost, no structures, or only a few, maybe small ones were damaged. Um, and it ends up, being for the most part an ecologically beneficial fire. There is some risk of, flooding and mudslides and all due to the terrain after that. But for the most part, the way it was managed, and all, part of that is beneficial for the forest, although that's not the way it was portrayed in the media. Um, so anyway, after that experience, of course, I was frustrated because I'm thousands of miles away, and you want to. At first, you're kind of in denial. You're worried about getting your stuff out, and then you kind of want to help. And I thought, well, if I can't be on the fire line swinging a Pulaski, maybe I could use my camera um, to kind of help my community process this issue, understand these issues, and be better equipped for it in the future. And so I called back Sean Scavell, the curator, and I said, "Yeah, count me in. I'm all in for this project." And I'm completely glad I did, because it totally changed my work and what I could do as an artist, in a way I didn't expect.
So you moved from a more photography based into mixed media at that point. Yes. Am I following
Yeah.
you correctly? Okay.
Well, as a result of that, so when I was brought on the project, I was brought on to do photography, based on my past work. And at the beginning of the project, we spent, I think it was 10 days in the field, with scientists from different agencies from Arizona and New Mexico, on the north rim of the Grand Canyon, camping out, going to different fire sites, meeting with firefighters, meeting with land managers. And the reason we were in the north rim of the Grand Canyon was, not because it's scenic, but because it's remote. And the north rim of the Grand Canyon is nothing at all like the south rim that most people visit as tourists. The south rim has kind of, become more of a Disneyland kind of experience. The north rim is 1,000 feet higher. It's cut off from the rest of Arizona by the Colorado River. Um, so, it's a 3 hour plus trip around from Flagstaff to get there. It's snowed out for a large part of the year in the winter. But because of its inaccessibility, there are portions of it that were not logged ever. There's portions of it that were logged. Because of its inaccessibility, um, in 1911, when the Forest Service adopted a policy of putting out fires everywhere, the north rim of the Grand Canyon was a hard place to do that. So, and there's no structures that were threatened by those fires and all. So some of those fires were allowed to burn. Um, so you have kind of an area that is a bit of a time capsule there as to what forests look like in different situations before and after human intervention. And the other thing that is unique about it, because it is a national park and was under consideration for being a park pretty early, unlike some other remote areas that also have those characteristics, the Grand Canyon was well photographed and well documented. So I saw aerial photographs um, from like, the early teens, uh, you know, just like less than a decade after the Wright brothers' first flight. So some of the first aerial photographic surveys that were done, I think they were done not ecologically for the forest, but just determining, what the landscape was, what the boundaries of the park were. But anyway, there's a lot of data essentially on the north rim of the Grand Canyon as to what a forest looked like with logging, without logging, what it looked like before fire suppression, with and without fire suppression, and how that forest has changed over time as more and more fires were put out.
That's I was
Um,
oh,
so
sorry.
that's the beginning of the project. Yeah.
I was just gonna
Um,
interject that I had been to
and
the North Grand Canyon, the North Rim. This was about maybe 8 years ago. There was a lot of fire going on there. And they closed like half the park, or 6 or 8 years ago, but or half the North Rim was closed down. But the forests were beautiful. But sorry for interrupting you. It just made me
yeah.
reminiscent of a very wonderful part. That's the only part of the Grand Canyon I've seen is the North Rim.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. It's a phenomenally beautiful place and a very diverse place. And there has been there's a large fire there in 2006, I believe. Um, it's a good laboratory for seeing the goods and bads of fire and things that can happen there. And so that's why the forest ecologist had selected that as a place we could go to see lots of different things and learn different things about fire. It was kind of a forest ecology boot camp. And, supposedly we learned a semester's or more worth of fire and forest ecology in that short time because they were able to take us from site to site and say, here's what's going on here, there. So we saw lots of different things, but it was very intense. Um, and, there wasn't even time for me to make any photographs in there because, we were so scheduled with so much information. Um, but really fascinating to be there in these recently burned landscapes and historically burned landscapes and really get hands on there, having people that are on the ground working with that explain what they're learning, what their researchers, you're seeing the evidence hands on was really powerful. Um, but I was a bit concerned because I came back from that trip like without any photographs. Um, and I didn't really know what I was going to do and how to properly convey these issues with photographs, which is what I was brought on the project to do. Um, and I realized that part of like the conventional media coverage for wildfire kind of plays into this narrative of, of men fighting heroically against fire, which they do, but that kind of plays into the narrative that fire is an unnatural thing when it is a natural part of the ecosystem here, and removing it has caused some of the large fires that or exacerbated some of the large fires that we have today. Um, and there's other people that have done that, that are embedded with the press, and the firefighters have the dramatic wall of flame, and the air tankers coming in and all that. And so other people have done that as good or better than I can do it. Um, so I thought, well, what can I do? And other people told me, they like my landscape work. They would say, oh, there's beautiful meadow where flowers are at, where aspens are regrowing after the fire. Um, you could go there and photograph that. And I was like, well, that's kind of what people expect me to do. I have done that before. And the power of art really lies in the unexpected, in our ability to see things differently and think about things differently. And in order to do that, in order to challenge my viewer, I had to challenge myself. Um, so I thought, what if I remove that intermediary of the camera between me and the object? What if I remove the intermediary of painting something, or, whatever artistic medium that we have? Ultimately, there's something that's lost in translation between what I experience out in the field. So I'm like, what if I could actually bring these materials that were burned in the fire into the gallery? What if I could work with fire itself as the medium, as opposed to painting or photographing fire? Um, and in short, many months and experiments and failures later, that's what I came up with for the show Fires of Change. I created 3 pieces. Um, One was a new method of, I would burn a fire and coat a panel in beeswax and hold that above the fire. And as the smoke would heat up the wax, it would become entrapped in the beeswax over time. But it has, sometimes it fails and the panel light's on fire, and it's a disaster. So there's a bit of a performance there as well. But the finished piece is just this kind of ethereal, floating smoke in space, that conveys that energy of the fire that I don't have complete control over. And so the fact that I don't have complete control over that medium, that it can light on fire and go disastrously wrong, and does at times, um, has an energy to it when you see those pieces in person. That is an energy that doesn't come from when I have control over a process and paint it or photograph it. Um, and the other piece I created was a sculpture called Box and Burn, and that was a tree that was felled here, um, and then it was sculpted by further burning. And then the third piece was an installation, and they all 3 pieces worked together to tell that story of fire and how we changed the landscape and changed the fire regime over time. That final piece is a giant installation that is about 24 trees that were burned and reburned in that slide fire I talked about originally, and the Schultz fire, which is another big fire here in Flagstaff. Um, so they are burned trunks of trees that are freestanding in the gallery. And then the other side of that are trees that I gathered from a thinning project here that our local fire department was working on an area called Observatory Mesa. And they're all small diameter pines that are growing very close together. And so as the wildland firefighters were going through thinning this forest, I worked with them to have them set aside certain trees. And then I gathered those, dried them out, and made them into a kind of it's like a stair step spiral that goes from about 2 feet to, over 6 feet tall. And those, so you have a kind of a split circle in all these forms, but in an installation, there's a kind of a growing spiral um, of these small diameter trees getting denser and denser and denser and larger as the forest, in the absence of fire, has gotten more dense with young, thin trees and become more fire prone. And then you have the burn trees. You have small, frequent, short ones, and they build and build up into larger and larger, taller ones. And so just as the fire has gone from frequent low intensity fires here in northern Arizona to infrequent but more catastrophic fires. Um, and those two things have fed into each other. Um, yeah, so those were the three pieces.
So it's almost like it creates fuel. You're showing how
Yeah,
it can
those
create
changes in the
fuel, or
forest,
right, if you're not doing the proper.
what wildland firefighters will call a fuel load, has increased. So historically here, it's a little bit different everywhere, but here we're in the Ponderosa pine forest, and that's a common forest type throughout the American West. Um, and Ponderosa pine forests are usually historically, they have frequent fires. Frequent meaning every, 5 to 10 years you'll have a fire, but they're pretty low intensity. They vary, of course, but um, and the trees are meant to the large older trees will usually survive those fires, and it will take out the younger trees and kind of thin the forest out. So the composition of forests throughout the West, especially in fire-prone forests, if you take away fire, the forest adapts and changes in a way that assumes that fire has gone away, and those changes lead to higher fuel loads. Those changes lead to more catastrophic wildfires in the future. And one of the changes, if we look at historical forests, they're much less homogeneous, meaning that they're clumpy. There's meadows, there's areas of high density. Um, they're much less irregular, or they're much more irregular in terms of the distribution of trees. There's much more variety in terms of the age of trees. So there's very large, old growth trees. Um, and you have, trees of varying ages all the way down. Um, but what happened, here in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, things were clear cut. And then all the trees grew back at the same time. And, and fire at that same time was kept out of the landscape. And so without fire to kind of thin out those trees, you have a forest that is very dense and very homogeneous with continuous um, swaths of young to middle-aged trees, but the trees are smaller, they're thinner, they're closer together than they used to be, and they're more homogeneous. Um, they're competing with each other, and you see a lot of times these clumps of what firefighters will call dog hair trees, where their trees are just kind of inherent. They never get to their full potential. They're small, thin diameter, close together. And when you get a fire in that kind of forest, it's easy for it to burn. It burns. There's not breaks and clumps. It becomes the catastrophic fires that we're seeing today. So that's not the only problem and cause, but that's one of the major contributing factors to the catastrophic fires that we have today. And those kind of fires where in a lower intensity fire, those big old growth trees are well protected against those types of fires. But when you get a huge catastrophic fire, in a windstorm like we're seeing today, it'll take out everything and nothing survives. And ponderosa pines, the way they work is um, the big trees typically survive the fires, and they're the seed source. And they'll so it's normal for the forest grows up, it gets dense, there's a fire, It clears thing out is the process of succession, forest succession. And then, the large trees typically survive. They drop their cones, they reseed new trees over time. Um, but once that seed bank is gone, and once that forest is gone, which creates its own microclimate, then what we're seeing today is what's called type conversion, which is where that forest doesn't grow back. It becomes a grassland or a shrubland. Um, and especially with changing climate, if a forest kind of creates its own little microclimate of shade and moisture, and then when you remove all those trees, now it's not there's not that kind of protected climate to come back. And if the climate is changing, getting just a little bit hotter, a little bit drier, it's very hard for that forest to reestablish on its own. But I think I've gone off on a bit of a tangent
That's okay. No,
with
I've
that.
been loving it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm an artist, not a fire ecologist, but um, these are that's one of the issues that we see here, and that's the issue that piece is addressing. And if you look at the visuals I sent, that's one that's you'll see it, and it's one I like featured in there. That tends to, people like that one. So it's a spiral. It's 14 feet across, and so people can walk through it and around it. Um, and back to my earlier comment, the great thing about it is that you can walk right up to those burned trees. Um, you can walk right through that solid of trees that are there, which is an unusual experience, And yeah, if you push them, they will fall over. So we're trusting the the public with that. Um, but part of my reason for going with this more abstract work and bringing these materials, natural materials, into the gallery is when we talk about an issue like climate change or wildfire, for instance. It's hard for us to make any progress on these issues because they become so politicized. And I don't think it should be a political issue. It should be a common sense issue. Um, but it requires a political solution, a legislative solution that requires the public to understand and be on board with. And the problem with an exhibition about these kind of issues is a lot of times you lead with an artist statement, and when you read the artist statement, you can kind of see, a political view or what has become politicized. And so people read the language, and if they see things in the language that they agree or disagree with, they kind of dig into their pre-existing perception. And that's a hard place to get people to think more critically about these issues that we face. And one of the great things about art is that there's a way of connecting with people, with their emotions and their experience that kind of predates language. If you think about a great work of art that you've seen, just take a minute and think about it and visualize it. And it's difficult to put it in the words precisely. And I think that is because artists have a way of tapping into our sensory experience directly in a way that circumvents the language center of the brain. And we're able to tap into part of the human experience that is deeper than the vessel of language can hold. So I thought, what if I could bring that direct sensory experience into the gallery? So by removing those intermediaries, and by not having the artist statement front and center when you walk in the gallery, what you encounter is the smell of burned wood, the sight of burned trees, of dead trees that have been killed, um, of glittering real aspen leaves soaked in wax that are rising up from the ashes. And these are all very abstract forms. There's nothing there that's telling you what to think about it. It's just asking you to feel about it. And I think as an artist, then we're connecting with people and opening their minds in a way that they're in awe of things. They're experiencing it directly. And then when we get partway through the exhibition, we can introduce some of the science, some ideas around there and get them thinking. But I'm just trying to create a charged atmosphere where they can make their own discoveries. And I think that's a much more powerful experience than if I tell them what I'm thinking and what I think they should think.
I would agree. If you tap into someone's raw emotions, they're going to feel more passionately about the decision they came up with versus leading
Right.
the horse to water.
Yeah. And they may come up, they may interpret the work differently than I do. May come up, with conclusions that are different than mine as a risk that we take as artists. But it's worth taking that risk in order for people to experience the eureka moment of discovery that comes from encountering a great work of art. Um, I'm inspired by things like Stonehenge, like Chaco Canyon in New Mexico. Um, Works by quote unquote primitive artists because I think they address the human experience, the sense of mystery, of wonder, um, that has been with our species for thousands of years. Um, and I think those artists feel felt that at that time just like I do now. I go into those places and I'm filled with awe and wonder. And I don't know what they mean. I don't know what they were about, but I feel something deep inside me that resonates with my human experience. And that's what I hope my viewers come away with as well.
That is great. You were a wonderful interview, by the way. You just take off and
Sorry, I didn't ramble on a
no,
bit so you can kind of
no,
keep me
this was
going where you want.
amazing. This is you pretty much addressed majority of my questions. I mean, is there anything you would like to add that maybe you missed? Kind of just about, I mean, we talked a lot about your passion for fire and using or how it actually is meant to be there. We will always have wildfires. We should always have wildfires. I loved your passion behind that. Um, but we really didn't tap on a lot of your other exhibitions. So I didn't know if there's anything else you wanted to talk about or address. We have a few more minutes left, so if that's
Yeah. Um, it's a follow up on the thread I was going with kind of, primitive artwork and stuff. If you look at the work about fire, and to a lesser extent, my work about water and stuff too. Would I try to go? I guess I try to address these profound, and difficult issues with as simple a form as I can. And that was the reason for my letting go of photography and all was, in order to solve these problems, it's kind of more of a cultural perception thing, that I can comment on as an artist that people can connect with. And that we've had, this idea, that we can control the landscape, that we can, and we're trying to do what we think is a good thing, right? Nobody likes seeing trees die. Nobody likes seeing wildfires or, wildlife die. Um, that we think we can prevent death, by preventing wildfire. But when you do that, you change the ecosystem in a way that by trying to prevent death, you have severed the cycle of life. So you'll see these circular forms in my work that are a lot of times split or severed. And those reference ecological cycles that have been disrupted by humanity. Sometimes, for what we think is trying to preserve them or noble, but has unintended consequences that are showing up today that put that entire ecosystem at risk, and lead to a much greater loss of life in the long term. Um, and then tying it back to, those primitive structures, trying to have as simple a form as I can as open-ended of a form as I can. I want people to walk in and kind of see the work. In the exhibition Rethinking Fire, you don't see any man-made pigments or bright colors. All you see is black, white, and the colors of natural materials. And those colors are much more subtle and nuanced than I could ever paint or draw. But when we get, synthetic pigments in there that are really brightly colored, your eye kind of doesn't notice those nuances and subtleties as much. So I want to put the spotlight on those natural materials. Um, but you also don't really see my artist hand as much. I want the work to kind of be like encountering one of those ruins or works of primitive art where it seems like it was just kind of left there, or grew in place. And you don't really see the artist forcing it in any way. It just seems like it should kind of naturally be where it is. And then when you walk around it, you begin to wonder, well, how are these things freestanding? How is this giant, solid of thin trees not falling over? And I don't see any fasteners or way that's doing that. There's kind of a mystery to it, like those ancient sites. Um, but people discover that once they've spent time with the work. So I try to leave that sense of mystery and wonder in the work. Now, when you walk through Thinking Fire, each piece does have a quote from a scientist about it. But it's not it's not clear like what you should think and all that. It's just kind of presenting a compelling quote from a scientist about different aspects about wildfire and smoke. And there's lots of different things that we could go into um, about fire itself, but it's different in different places. Um, but it's a combination of a bunch of different things, and it's a complex issue. And solving it is a complex issue of decisions that we have to make as a society. But I want people to understand the role of fire in the landscape and understand that we have to accept that to some degree. Think about how and where we're building, um, how much we want to spend and allocate towards forest management, um, how climate and climate change is playing into it. Um, there are lots of different things, as well as historical climate variations, regardless of climate change, those are also playing a factor.